You know that feeling when you were in school and it seemed like every subject lived in its own little bubble? History over here, math way over there, and English in another universe. Ever wish you could see how it all connected, how the puzzle pieces fit together? Well, that's exactly what we're diving into today. Our topic for this deep dive: subject matter integration in education.
And you've brought some really interesting sources to the table for this one. They trace the history of this idea, the research that's been done, and how it's actually being applied in schools, with a particular focus on how language arts can be interwoven with other subjects.
Right. Our mission here is to understand why this concept of connecting subjects is considered so crucial for learning. We want to pull out the key findings and the different approaches that educational research has pointed to over the years. We're talking about looking at studies that span decades, all the way to seeing how this plays out in classrooms today.
So let's get right to the heart of it. This idea of integrating subject matter isn't a flash-in-the-pan trend. Educators have been recognizing the power of connecting different subjects to deepen understanding, improve memory, and make learning more applicable, for a very long time.
It's almost surprising how far back this thinking goes. Our sources show that there have been consistent calls for this kind of integration throughout the 20th century, from the 80s all the way back to thinkers like Dewey much earlier. It seems like this idea keeps coming up because there's this fundamental sense that it just makes learning more meaningful.
What's fascinating is that while this value has been acknowledged for so long,
Mhm.
actually putting it into widespread practice and rigorously studying its impact has been, well, a different story. But before we get into the research findings, it's helpful to have a way to think about what integration really means when we're talking about language arts. The sources mention Schwab's four commonplaces as a useful lens: the learner, the teacher, the content, and the context.
Okay, let's unpack this a bit. How do these four elements come together when we're thinking about integrating subjects from a language arts perspective?
Well, um, when we consider the learner, integration is about ensuring that what they're learning resonates with their own lives and experiences. For the teacher, it means intentionally designing learning activities that draw connections between different subjects. The content itself needs to be seen as interconnected, not as isolated pieces of information. And the context, both within and beyond the classroom walls, needs to actively support and highlight these connections.
That really clarifies it. It's about seeing the whole curriculum as a web, not just a bunch of separate strands. And the sources point out that there have been so many different terms used for this idea over the years, it's almost hard to keep track.
It is a long list. You hear things like aligned curriculum, authentic learning, coherent curriculum, holistic teaching, integrated curriculum, interdisciplinary instruction, and that's just a few. What's interesting is that whether it's referred to as language across the curriculum, thematic units, or whole language, they all converge on this core principle of carefully weaving different subjects into a cohesive educational experience.
So it's much more than just a casual mention of history in an English assignment. It's a much deeper and more intentional connection. And when we talk about the curriculum itself, what are the key things that get integrated?
According to the sources, there are really three fundamental components of the curriculum that become integrated: the content itself, the knowledge, information we want to impart, language strategies and skills, those crucial tools of listening, reading, writing, and speaking that we use to understand and share that knowledge. And finally, dispositions, the attitudes and beliefs we hold that shape how we interpret and use language.
Right, so it's not just about memorizing facts from different subjects. It's about how we use language to engage with those facts and the mindset we bring to the entire learning process. And it seems like the teacher plays a really pivotal role in making all of this happen. They're the ones who have to put these different elements together.
Absolutely. Teachers are responsible for defining and blending this knowledge, these skills, and these dispositions into coherent units that form the curriculum. They need to take into account their students, their backgrounds, strengths, and needs, as well as the learning environment, from the classroom to the wider community. The aim is to create opportunities where students need to solve real-world problems that naturally require drawing on knowledge from multiple disciplines.
And what about the students themselves? What's their part in this integrated approach? Are they just passive recipients of these connections?
Not at all. Learners need to understand why this integration is important. One of our sources quotes Frank Smith, who raised a really insightful point. Instead of asking how language arts should be integrated in students' minds, we should ask why they were ever separated in the first place. It really highlights the need for both learners and teachers to see the curriculum as a unified whole that connects with the students' actual lives.
That's a powerful way to think about it. If students don't see the relevance, the connections probably won't stick. And it seems like the world we live in now, this knowledge era, as the sources describe it, makes this kind of integration even more critical.
Precisely. In a world that demands adaptability, problem-solving skills, and a commitment to lifelong learning, making those clear connections between different subjects, their purposes, and our everyday lives becomes absolutely essential. It's about preparing students for a future where knowledge isn't confined to separate boxes.
Okay, so we've laid the groundwork for understanding what integrated subject matter is and why it's considered important. But you mentioned earlier that despite this long-standing recognition, there hasn't always been a lot of research specifically documenting the real-world effects of this integration.
That's right. It's quite surprising, but research from the 20th century actually indicates that even though language arts took up a significant portion of the school day, I'm talking 40 to 60% in some studies, the actual integration of subject matter was quite limited. For instance, studies in the 1970s found that less than 5% of language arts instruction involved truly integrated activities across different language modes or with other subjects like science and social studies.
Wow, less than 5%. That really highlights a significant gap between the ideal and the reality. What was the typical curriculum structure like back then that might explain this lack of integration?
Well, the curriculum tended to be very segmented. Different subjects were taught in isolation, and even within language arts, skills like reading, spelling, and writing were often taught separately, following these rigid hierarchical approaches often found in basal readers. There wasn't much emphasis on connecting these skills to actual content or to other subject areas. The focus was often on rote memorization of facts, with limited opportunities for students to really engage deeply with material or explore it further.
It sounds like a very skills-based, almost mechanical approach, rather than one that fostered deeper understanding through connections. So, how did researchers begin to tackle this issue of limited integration in practice?
In response to this, the late 1980s saw the emergence of two significant lines of literacy research. One focused on what they called explanation and responsive elaboration in reading, and the other on cognitive strategies in writing. What's interesting to note is that in these initial studies, the researchers themselves often took a very active role in demonstrating to teachers how they could integrate the curriculum, really focusing on the interplay between students and content.
So, it was more about researchers showing teachers how integration could work in the classroom.
Exactly. The emphasis was on demonstrating how language is used for real, authentic purposes across different subjects, creating supportive learning environments that encourage things like free choice reading, the use of student-authored materials, authentic writing tasks, the development of thematic units, and teachers themselves actively modeling the use of reading and writing in their own teaching.
Let's delve into that first area of research: teacher explanations and responsive elaborations in reading. What was the main goal of this work?
The primary goal was to help students not only learn various reading strategies, but also to develop a deeper understanding of when, why, and how to apply these strategies effectively across different subject areas. It was really about fostering metacognitive awareness, getting students to think about their own thinking as readers.
And what did they discover about students who initially struggled with reading? What were some of their common understandings or misunderstandings?
Often, these students had a very limited grasp of how the reading process actually works. They tended to believe that reading skills were simply about memorizing rules, that the main goal was to pronounce words correctly and recall everything verbatim. They also frequently saw subjects as completely separate entities, not realizing that the reading skills they used in English class could also be applied when reading a science textbook, for example.
So, this research aimed to broaden their understanding of reading and its relevance across the curriculum. What were the key elements of the instructional approach they implemented?
The approach involved teachers providing explicit and consistent explanations over extended periods about the mental processes involved in using different reading strategies. They really focused on explaining why a particular strategy might be helpful and how to apply it flexibly in various subject-specific contexts. A key aspect was emphasizing what to do when a reader's understanding breaks down and developing that metacognitive awareness to monitor comprehension.
Can you give us a concrete example of how a teacher might explain a reading strategy in a way that integrates it across subjects?
Certainly. Let's take the strategy of using context clues to figure out the meaning of an unknown word. Instead of just telling students to look around the word, the teacher might verbalize their own thought process. Okay, I've encountered a word I don't know. Let me look at the words and sentences around it. What clues do they give me about what this word might mean in this specific situation? They would then provide ample opportunities for practice using different types of texts, perhaps including examples from a science article or a social studies passage, explicitly showing how context clues can be a valuable tool for understanding unfamiliar vocabulary in any subject.
It sounds like they were essentially teaching a problem-solving approach to reading.
Exactly. Students learn to recognize when their comprehension faltered, then to identify potential strategies that might help, try them out, check if their understanding improved, and then continue reading. It was a very active and conscious process. The teachers made a deliberate effort to connect these strategies to reading tasks in all subject areas.
And then there were the follow-up studies on responsive elaborations. What was the focus of that next phase of research?
Those studies aimed to delve deeper into the relationship between what teachers were thinking and doing in their classrooms and the resulting outcomes for students as they integrated reading into other subjects. The overarching goal was to cultivate strategic readers who not only possessed the necessary skills but also had a strong understanding of when and why to use them, along with a positive disposition towards reading.
And this brings us back to that idea of process into content, doesn't it?
Yes, that was a central tenet. The idea is that you shouldn't teach reading skills in isolation, or simply have students read content without helping them understand how reading strategies can aid their comprehension. The approach advocated for consciously teaching how the language system works within the context of different subjects, and then actively encouraging students to apply that knowledge across those subjects.
So what kind of impact did this explicit strategy instruction have on the students' reading abilities and their overall understanding of content?
The findings were quite significant. They found that explicit instruction in reading strategies had a demonstrably positive effect on students' ability to use those strategies and their overall comprehension of the content they were reading. Students who received these explicit explanations reported actually using strategic reasoning while reading and could even articulate their thinking processes. Furthermore, they observed significant improvements in reading comprehension scores on standardized tests for students whose teachers employed these teacher explanation methods within the process into content framework.
That's a pretty clear indication of the effectiveness of this integrated approach to reading instruction. Were there any other notable effects on the students' perceptions or approaches to reading?
Yes, in interviews conducted after lessons, students in the teacher explanation classrooms showed a much greater conscious awareness of when and how to apply reading strategies in connected texts. And in concept interviews, these students were more likely to view reading as a self-directed activity involving problem solving, where reading skills serve as tools to aid comprehension, and the ultimate purpose is to select appropriate strategies for use across all subjects.
So it wasn't just about getting better reading scores, it was about fostering a fundamental shift in how students perceived reading and their own agency as readers. And the responsive elaboration studies further supported these findings, right?
Absolutely. Those studies indicated that the students who demonstrated the most substantial growth in their reading comprehension, their metacognitive awareness, their strategic reading actions, and who developed more positive attitudes towards reading were taught by teachers who consistently used both explanations and responsive elaborations. This really highlighted the powerful impact of this type of integrated instruction on developing well-rounded strategic readers.
And the teacher's role in facilitating this seems absolutely critical. It's not just about telling students what a reading strategy is, but about actively showing them how to use it as a flexible tool for understanding across all areas of their learning.
Precisely. It involves teachers reframing skills as problem-solving strategies by carefully analyzing the underlying cognitive and metacognitive components. They need to provide clear and accessible explanations, model how to effectively use the strategy, and consistently emphasize its relevance and application across all subject areas. The example of teaching compound words not just as a vocabulary skill, but as a problem-solving strategy for decoding unfamiliar words and texts from various subjects really exemplifies this integrated approach.
Okay, so we've taken a deep dive into the reading side of integration. Now let's turn our attention to the second key area of research you mentioned, cognitive strategies in writing, or CSIW. What was the primary focus of this line of inquiry?
CSIW also embraced the core principle of process into content, but with a specific focus on teaching and learning writing across the entire curriculum. A key emphasis was placed on helping students develop a heightened awareness of their intended audience, the specific purpose of their writing, and effective organizational strategies, particularly the understanding and use of different text structures.
Text structures, those are the different ways that writers organize their ideas, like compare and contrast or cause and effect, right?
Exactly. These are the internalized organizational frameworks that writers use to structure their thoughts. Researchers collaborated closely with teachers over a 3-year period to investigate how to effectively use these text structures in expository writing within content areas, specifically integrating reading, writing, social studies, science, and critical thinking skills.
And what were the main components of this CSIW approach? What did the students and teachers actually do in the classroom?
There were several key components. First, students engaged in frequent and sustained writing on a daily basis, rather than just weekly, as a way to deeply integrate writing with their learning in various content areas and to enhance their critical thinking and comprehension skills. This concept of writing to learn was central, recognizing that writing can be a powerful tool for accessing prior knowledge and connecting it with new information.
So it was about using writing not just as a means of assessment, but as a tool for actively constructing understanding.
Precisely. Students were also provided with ample time to develop their ideas, explore their existing knowledge, and elaborate on their thoughts, with a significant degree of control over their writing time and the content they were addressing. They were encouraged to draw upon previous work, classroom discussions, and even to revise their ideas as they wrote. Another crucial element was explicitly teaching students how to monitor and regulate their organizational and thinking strategies. They utilized colored think sheets, guided by the acronym Power Planning, Organizing, Writing, Editing, Revising, and also employed pattern guides or graphic organizers that included specific questions and keywords tailored to different text structures, such as explanation, comparison contrast, problem solution, and narrative.
Those sound like really practical tools to help students navigate the complexities of the writing process.
They were designed to make the often invisible processes of planning and organizing more concrete and manageable for students. For example, a pattern guide for an explanation text structure might include prompting questions like, what am I trying to explain? What happened first? What happened second? Teachers also played a vital role by modeling their own writing processes with the students, explicitly demonstrating how to use these various text structures within different content areas. So a teacher might model writing a problem solution paragraph in science or sequence of events in social studies.
And it wasn't solely focused on the act of writing itself. There was also a deliberate connection made to reading, wasn't there?
Absolutely. Reading and writing were intentionally integrated through peer editing activities. Students worked collaboratively as editors, providing feedback to their classmates and acting as a real audience for their writing. This process not only helped the writers identify areas for revision, but also strengthened both the readers' and writers' comprehension and composition skills. They engaged in discussions about the intended purpose of their writing, and the questions posed by their peers often help writers recognize where their communication might be unclear. Furthermore, developing comprehension monitoring skills in the context of peer editing helps students to become more aware of and correct comprehension breakdowns in other reading situations as well. The integration of reading and writing for the purpose of communication really helped to bridge the gap between these two essential literacy processes.
It sounds like a very collaborative and metacognitively focused approach to developing writing skills. What did the researchers learn about student learning and the overall impact of the CSIW approach?
Researchers studied both students with learning disabilities and their typically developing peers, examining their awareness and control their metacognitive knowledge of expository writing and how this related to the quality of their writing. They found that students with learning disabilities generally demonstrated less awareness of effective writing strategies, the various steps involved in the writing process, effective ways to present expository ideas, and how to integrate information from multiple sources. This lack of metacognitive knowledge put them at a significant disadvantage in content area subjects that relied heavily on expository writing.
That makes sense. If you're not consciously aware of effective writing strategies, it's going to be much more challenging to communicate your understanding in writing.
Precisely. The study also revealed a strong correlation between students' metacognitive knowledge and the quality of their writing performance. Students who were better at predicting and recognizing effective composing strategies tended to produce higher quality written work. Similarly, students who showed a greater sensitivity to different text structures were judged as more competent writers overall. The strongest relationships were found between writing performance and students' awareness of the various steps in the writing process and their ability to gather and integrate information from different sources.
So understanding the how-to of writing was very closely linked to the actual quality of the written product. And I recall the outline mentioning that student learning varied across different classrooms, which led to a subsequent study focusing on the teachers.
Yes, the researchers recognized that teachers played a critical role in how effectively these cognitive writing strategies were implemented in the classroom. They observed that teachers involved in the CSIW project held varying perspectives on teaching writing and employed different instructional practices. A follow-up study specifically examined the relationship between teachers' underlying beliefs about writing instruction and their actual classroom implementation of CSIW, as well as the impact on their students' understanding and writing performance.
And what were the key differences they observed in the teachers' perspectives and practices?
They identified two primary perspectives among the participating teachers. One was an externally focused perspective, where teachers view their role as primarily conveying information about decontextualized writing form and mechanical accuracy. Their instruction tended to involve teacher-assigned topics and information, with less explicit connection to the student's own writing processes. The other perspective was more internally focused, where teachers saw their role as guiding students to effectively communicate their own ideas and purpose to a specific audience within a written piece. These teachers more deeply integrated the writing process within the context of their students' lives and the curriculum content. Their instruction involved students informing each other about self-selected topics and purposes, and they explicitly linked mechanics and writing skills to the students' overall communication goals. They also asked more questions that prompted students to reflect on their intended audience and the meaning they were trying to convey. Classroom observations supported these distinctions, showing that internally focused teachers asked more questions that stimulated reflection on the students' papers, their chosen topics, their intended audience, and internal criteria for good writing. The writing process was also more closely integrated with student-chosen topics in these classrooms.
And did these different teaching perspectives and practices correlate with differences in student learning outcomes?
Absolutely. The analysis of student writing samples collected over time revealed that the students of the internally focused teachers produced higher quality compositions in terms of the clarity of their ideas, the effectiveness of their organization, their word choice, the overall flavor of their writing, and their use of language conventions compared to the students of the externally focused teachers. It appeared that contextualizing writing within the students' own lives and purposes had a significant positive impact on the quality of their content. Interestingly, while the externally focused teachers placed a greater emphasis on formal English grammar, the students of the internally focused teachers actually outperformed them in terms of their language usage in their writing, with no significant differences observed in the area of mechanics such as spelling, punctuation, and handwriting. This suggests that the internally focused teachers, by using the process into content approach and emphasizing contextualization, had a more positive overall influence on their students' writing, quality, and language use. In contrast, a more decontextualized focus on form and mechanics alone seemed to have a less positive overall impact.
That's a really important finding. It suggests that focusing on meaningful communication and integrating the writing process can lead to better overall writing, even in areas that are sometimes taught in isolation. So what was the key overarching lesson learned from this initial research on integrating reading and writing across the curriculum?
The initial research, through projects like teacher explanation in reading and cognitive strategies in writing, really demonstrated the potential of designing integrated curricula to help teachers connect literacy processes directly with content instruction. While these were implementation studies that introduced new teaching strategies, it became clear that the way in which teachers themselves integrated content and the complexities of incorporating these new ideas into their own thinking and the broader school culture were absolutely critical factors. This understanding really paved the way for a shift in focus towards examining integration at a much larger school-wide level.
That makes perfect sense. It's one thing for researchers to introduce a new approach, but it's another thing entirely for teachers to truly understand, adopt, and adapt it within the unique context of their own classrooms and schools. And that brings us to the next stage of our deep dive. This move towards school-wide integration and the valuable insights gained from those professional development school settings.
Yes. Building on the foundational findings from the teacher explanation and CSIW research, 2 professional development schools, or PDSs, were established at the elementary level. These were designed as long-term collaborative partnerships between the local school districts and university educators with a shared commitment to ongoing inquiry into teaching and learning. Their aim was to collaboratively restructure the schools in ways that would enhance student learning.
And what did this restructuring look like in practical terms? What kinds of changes were implemented?
There were a few key areas of change. In terms of school leadership, they often moved towards more collaborative models, establishing steering committees that included teachers, the school principal, and university faculty, all working together to identify and implement improvements in teaching and learning. Additionally, there was a significant emphasis placed on the collaborative development and implementation of thematic, integrated units of study, with classroom teachers working closely with university faculty to design these interdisciplinary learning experiences. One of the PDS sites, Spartan Village, continued to build on the research related to teacher explanation and responsive elaboration in reading, while the other, Kendon, focused on the insights gained from the CSIW research and the studies on teacher conceptions of writing.
Let's begin by exploring the science and literacy integration efforts at Spartan Village. How did they approach this collaborative development and implementation of teaching and learning?
At Spartan Village, the collaborative efforts were very much grounded in the process into content framework. They adopted school-wide themes each year. Examples included changes in matter and water in our world. And these overarching themes then provided the context for intentionally integrating literacy and science across all subject areas. Their underlying view was that literacy was not simply about acquiring isolated skills, but rather about actively creating and communicating meaning. Science provided a rich and engaging body of content that naturally lent itself to meaningful communication.
So science wasn't just another subject to be taught in isolation. It became a vital context for developing and applying literacy skills in a meaningful way.
Exactly. They viewed science as a community with its own specialized language and particular ways of constructing meaning. Reading, writing, and oral discourse, especially collaborative problem-solving and scientific reasoning, were all recognized as essential components of this integrated approach. Within these thematic units, students were provided with numerous opportunities for engaging in guided discussions, reading a variety of texts including books, journals, poems, magazines, and newspapers, and participating in different forms of writing, such as reports, journals, and even poems. They also observed films and conducted experiments, all of which led to questions and the development of initial drafts, both individually and in small groups. Teachers provided explicit and adaptive instruction in reading and writing strategies, very much in line with the process into content idea right within these authentic learning conversations, precisely when and where it was needed.
It sounds like a very responsive and student-centered approach to instruction. Were there any specific classroom structures or routines they implemented to support this integration?
Yes, they developed some really interesting classroom routines. For instance, they had a sharing table where students could voluntarily gather to discuss their emerging drafts, exchange ideas, and receive constructive feedback from their peers and the teacher. They also had an editing table where students could provide focused feedback on each other's written work, specifically addressing both the accuracy of the science content and the clarity and correctness of their language usage. And finally, they utilized the author's chair as a platform for students to orally share their final drafts with the class. Throughout all of this, there was an ongoing emphasis on authentic reading, writing, and meaningful conversations related to the overarching thematic unit.
That's a fantastic way to foster a community of learners who are actively engaged with the content through multiple modes of communication. And I remember the outline mentioning that these thematic units often culminated in a special event.
They did indeed. Each thematic unit culminated in a school-wide science conference where students, teachers, and even invited science specialists would present interactive sessions related to the year's theme. For example, during the Changes in Matter theme, students might have presented on the process of melting and cooling chocolate. The students themselves got to choose which sessions they wanted to attend. These events were quite significant and even garnered coverage from local media outlets.
Wow, that must have been an incredibly engaging and empowering experience for the students. Did the research conducted at Spartan Village reveal any specific impacts on the students' literacy skills as a result of this integration?
Yes. Researchers observed that students employed 4 distinct types of oral discourse strategies in their collaborative conversations, which facilitated their knowledge acquisition within a supportive, respectful, and responsible learning environment. These strategies included verbalizing connections between ideas, actively monitoring the co-construction of knowledge within the group, making their own thinking visible to others, and using language that signaled shared ownership of the ideas being discussed. This line of inquiry suggested that these specific discourse strategies played a significant role in the students' development of subject matter expertise, which aligns with earlier findings from the teacher explanation and responsive elaboration studies regarding the impact of strategy instruction on learning.
And what about more quantitative measures, like standardized test scores in science? Did they see any changes there?
They did. When they analyzed the results from the Michigan Education Assessment Progress, or MEAP, science tests, they found some very encouraging trends. In the 1991-1992 school year, which was before the implementation of these thematic units, Spartan Village fifth graders scored 80%, compared to 83% for other schools in East Lansing and 69% statewide. However, in the 1992-1993 school year, the first year of implementing the thematic units, Spartan Village's score jumped to 96%, compared to 87% for other East Lansing schools and 71% statewide. This meant Spartan Village was 9% higher than the rest of East Lansing and a remarkable 25% higher than the state average. In the following year, 1993-1994, Spartan Village continued to perform strongly, scoring 90% compared to 86% for other East Lansing schools and 72% statewide. They were still 4% higher than their local peers and 18% higher than the state average.
Those are really impressive results, suggesting a clear positive impact of this integrated approach on student understanding in science. And it wasn't just about test scores, was it? The teachers themselves reported observing other significant benefits in their students.
Absolutely. In a taking stock session held at the end of the 1993-1994 school year, teachers reported observing that children conduct respectful interactions more frequently, that at-risk students were not isolated and had more opportunities and support. I don't understand became an acceptable statement, Also that many students offer and receive help, that cooperative work had improved significantly, that students displayed increased self-esteem and confidence, becoming more willing to present their work and enhanced ability to pose and respond to questions, more frequent child-to-child science-related conversations, increased listening ability, and a shift in students' perception of themselves as both teachers and learners within the classroom community.
It paints a picture of a much more engaged, collaborative, and supportive learning environment overall. Now, let's turn to the other PDS, Kendon, and their action research with teachers and parents. How did their approach to school-wide integration differ from what was happening at Spartan Village?
At Kendon, the process had a slightly different emphasis, focusing on teachers and researchers collaboratively engaging in reading and discussion around the implementation and findings of the CSIW research, as well as exploring teachers' underlying conceptions about writing instruction. Teachers engaged in discussions about their own teaching philosophies, observed classroom videos, and critically examined their own reflections as they worked together to design their own integrated K-2 curriculum.
So it was a more inquiry-based approach, really driven by the teacher's own experiences, questions, and reflections on their practice.
Exactly. Their integration efforts centered on embedding, composing, and comprehension strategies within subject matter content, using the power strategies they had learned about, incorporating oral presentations, and having students author various types of texts across different subjects and developmental levels. For example, kindergarten students planned and delivered oral presentations using finger puppets, often focusing on nature or geometric shapes, with planning taking place both at school and at home in collaboration with their parents. Second graders presented their own original compositions and interpretations of children's literature and poems. They also created informational texts, utilizing the text structures they had learned through CSIW on various school subjects like animal habitats, Michigan, and fine arts, often to inform their classmates about topics of personal interest or concern. Regular student and parent conferences were also held to collaboratively monitor the students' growth in their composing and comprehension strategies.
And the collaboration extended beyond the school staff to include parents in a significant way, didn't it?
Yes. A key aspect of the Kendon approach was the collaborative work of teachers, student teachers, teacher educators, and parents in studying student growth in reading and writing. They did this by examining student portfolios together during parent informancy meetings. This collaborative approach at Kendon represented a shift from the initial CSIW project. In the original project, researchers had primarily introduced the cognitive strategy ideas. At Kendon, however, the teachers and parents actively worked alongside teacher educators and teacher candidates on an action research project aimed at integrating reading and writing within their specific content areas in a way that best fit their unique school context.
So the research questions, the instructional plans, and the ways of addressing any challenges that arose were all collaboratively developed by the people within that specific school community.
Precisely. The focus was on conducting literacy research together to cultivate a democratic learning community. Everyone involved, teachers, educators, students, and parents, shared responsibility for studying the process of integration and analyzing the data they collected. They utilized a process called co-generative dialogue to exchange information from their diverse perspectives and collaboratively define what literacy integration truly meant within their particular context. The overarching goals were to share knowledge, values, power, and active participation, drawing on action science methodology to examine both conventional and non-conventional classroom activities, while also considering the underlying beliefs and feelings that different stakeholders brought to the process.
It sounds like a much more organic and context-sensitive approach to implementing and studying integration.
It was. The action researchers studied integration as an ongoing process of incorporating new ideas into the curriculum and the school environment, with a strong emphasis on social, cultural, and political reflections. Teachers and educators would describe their critical concerns and problems, sharing their underlying reasoning, their theories, and use. The PDS team then worked together to co-generate ideas at the intersection of their various interests and experiences, always taking into account the intentions and perspectives of others. This led to ongoing discussions and a continuous process of examining and potentially reconstructing the social, cultural, and political context of their work.
You mentioned an example of second-grade teachers observing a student teacher. How did that particular event illustrate this collaborative process?
That's a great example. The second-grade teachers observed a lesson led by a student teacher that integrated reading, writing, and social studies. The student teacher had recently learned about integrated curriculum approaches and had co-planned and reflected on process writing strategies, including those from CSIW, during their college coursework. The experienced teachers had some prior familiarity with process writing through a district-level program. What was significant was the timing. During subsequent parent conferences, parents expressed considerable enthusiasm for their children's writing, which seemed to be positively influenced by the student teacher's explicit explanations and the examples in their portfolios. At the same time, one of the experienced teachers shared an article about a traveling writer's briefcase, an idea for sharing student writing beyond the classroom.
And how did this confluence of interests and observations lead to further action?
This combination of the parents' positive feedback and the teacher's sharing of the article sparked further discussion. Teacher educators then stepped in to help plan parent-teacher informancy meetings as a forum for continued dialogue. During these meetings, parents raised insightful questions and offered their own perspectives on their children's responses to the integrated instruction, including their engagement in writing, their topic selections, and their attention to mechanics. The teachers, in turn, began to question some of the conventional approaches to parent involvement and sought new ways to more effectively support their students' growth as writers. These discussions evolved significantly over time, really shaping their approach to integration.
It really highlights how at Kendon, the challenges of integration were not just about adopting new instructional techniques, but also about navigating the social and political dynamics within the school community.
It's exactly. The PDS team at Kendon found themselves not only creating an integrated curriculum, but also developing new practices for parent involvement and new forms of conversation that help to connect everyone's concerns and perspectives. Addressing obstacles to equal participation by acknowledging and legitimizing the concerns of all stakeholders was a crucial part of their process. The group actively challenged existing norms by making the underlying politics more visible, openly discussing their vulnerabilities, and intentionally sharing power. The concerns and experiences of teachers and parents were central to the entire process of questioning, developing, implementing, and monitoring the process into content approach in their specific setting.
So, to summarize the PDS experience, both Kendon and Spartan Village, while taking slightly different approaches, really emphasized teachers and researchers working together over several years to study teacher and student growth within the unique context of their schools. They explored the complexities of integrating curriculum on multiple levels, including the process into content changes for both teachers and researchers, and they both underscored the fundamental importance of Schwab's 4 commonplaces: learners, teachers, curriculum, and context as key areas to consider when studying and implementing integration.
Precisely. They both demonstrated the power of sustained collaboration and the importance of understanding the local context when trying to bring about meaningful and lasting change in educational practice.
This has been a really insightful look at how the research on subject matter integration has evolved and how it's being put into practice in schools. We've seen how the initial research on teacher explanation in reading and cognitive strategies in writing provided a foundation for thinking about integrated curriculum that supports both process and content knowledge. And the work in the professional development schools has deepened our understanding of teacher thinking and the importance of context. So as we look to the future, what are some of the key questions and principles we should keep in mind when thinking about language and subject matter integration?
That's a crucial question. And it brings us back to Schwab's 4 commonplaces as a framework for stimulating our thinking moving forward.
Okay, let's start with contents. What content do we integrate? What are the key considerations here?
Well, integration, in its most meaningful form, involves combining knowledge, skills, strategies, and those crucial dispositions that learners generate and interpret in a variety of settings. The curriculum really becomes something that is actively shaped by learners as they explore content from disciplines like science, literacy, cognition, and their own growth, all within their specific local contexts. Language arts integration, in particular, requires us to consciously connect the different modes of language listening, speaking, reading, and writing. Students need ongoing and deliberate practice in recognizing how oral and written discourse strategies work together as they use language across the curriculum. For us as teachers and researchers, it means actively working against the tendency to isolate strategies within language arts and other subjects. By consciously monitoring our own thinking, we can better communicate these connections and support learners in seeing them as well. It also requires us to critically examine our own assumptions as educators and researchers and to acknowledge the historical separation of subject matter. Studying how teachers, researchers, and students can effectively collaborate as co-researchers can be a valuable way to monitor our own ongoing process of integrating content in our teaching. This also implies that we need to integrate content from disciplinary scholars, not only in education but also in other relevant fields. Teachers and researchers can greatly benefit from studying the complex process of integrating new ideas into the school culture and understanding the ever-evolving political environment that shapes education. Paying attention to social and political changes is important content in any educational setting, including examining the dispositions and emotions that significantly affect cognitive development. Ultimately, the learning community, students, teachers, and researchers should be actively studying the effects of collaboration on learning itself. We need to cultivate in learners and in ourselves those adventurous, intellectually curious, understanding-seeking, planful, strategic, and metacognitive dispositions, always carefully evaluating the underlying reasons and values that inform our learning and teaching. The school environment should be a thoughtful space that truly values the purposes of all learners, fostering sensitivity to the ideas, needs, and values of others in all forms of communication. The principle of process into content should also extend to monitoring multiple processes and various forms of content knowledge. What we ultimately choose to integrate is not something predetermined, but rather something that is collectively determined by the learning community.
That really emphasizes the dynamic and participatory nature of curriculum development when we're talking about true integration. Now let's consider the second of Schwab's commonplaces, teachers as learners, learners as teachers who defines integration.
Right. Here, the emphasis shifts to recognizing that students, teachers, and researchers together form a dynamic learning community that is continuously investigating the integration of knowledge, skills, dispositions, and processes across all subjects. For integration to be truly effective and meaningful, it needs to resonate with the learners themselves, connecting relevant content and important concerns within their communities to their individual purposes and lives. All members of the community actively integrate content from both written texts and their lived experiences. Studying integration, therefore, necessitates connecting shared concerns, passions, and even vulnerabilities within the learning community. Integrating traditional disciplinary content into the lives of both teachers and students becomes most meaningful when these connections are co-generated through collaborative efforts involving teachers, students, parents, and researchers. This includes integrating ideas through the sharing of information and through conscious reasoning about the issues presented in both written and spoken texts. Explanations, learning opportunities, and presentations should come from all of these groups, not just from the teachers or the curriculum. Actively involving the local context and the broader community empowers learning and enriches traditional disciplines with diverse voices and perspectives. Parental involvement, in particular, brings a wealth of varied cultural, historical, and political interpretations to the learning process. The underlying principle here is that all learners, teachers, researchers, students, and parents need to develop metacognitive awareness about Schwab's four commonplaces. They need to actively monitor what content is deemed important and how that process into content integration actually occurs within their specific learning context.
That really highlights the importance of shared ownership and the idea that everyone in the learning ecosystem has a role to play in defining and shaping integration. Finally, let's consider the context. How do we integrate? What are the key environmental factors that support or hinder integration?
The learning environment is absolutely critical. We need to consciously cultivate an environment where all learners see themselves as active sense makers and as integrators of new content into their existing frameworks of knowledge. Integration requires both cognitive and emotional contextualization, meaning that learning needs to be connected to issues that are personally meaningful and important to the students. Teachers play a vital role in responsively elaborating on the connections they observe, helping students develop those essential connected habits of thought across the entire curriculum and throughout the school day. Strong support for school-wide integration is also absolutely essential. This allows faculty and teachers the time and opportunity to collaboratively examine curriculum connections and the logical sequencing of content across different grade levels. When districts place a heavy emphasis and accountability on isolated test outcomes, it's crucial that teachers have a significant voice and input in the decision-making processes related to curriculum integration. Similarly, if community members are held accountable for educational results, they also need to be self-accountable, participating in structuring the evaluation criteria and measures. This level of involvement allows teachers to organize curriculum content in a way that fosters natural and meaningful connections between different subjects. Researchers also have a crucial role to play in dissolving the traditional boundaries between theory and practice by working directly alongside teachers to illuminate their theories in use, their practical wisdom and beliefs about teaching and learning. Shared concerns and a sense of collective purpose evolve from co-generating mutual interests that connect all learners, teachers, researchers, students, and parents, fostering communities of scholars who are connected by and actively working on similar issues. Rather than being detached observers, all community members share internal commitments and purposes for learning, offering mutual support and encouragement. This kind of deep collaboration opens up possibilities for more substantive and sustained subject matter integration both within and between different grade levels. Palmer reminds us of the profound truth that meaningful connections significantly increase learning, and this includes incorporating content from disciplines that specifically study teachers, schools, and teacher education itself. Multiple disciplines and scholarly texts need to be critically examined within empowering learning communities. Ultimately, meaningful curriculum integration is not a static endpoint, but an ongoing growth process for all members of the community, students, teachers, and researchers alike. Recognizing the dynamic and interconnected nature of our work as community members is key. The most important principles guiding integration are those that are co-generated and contextualized by learners themselves, creating meaningful and caring school communities. While integrated curriculum may be known by many different names, it is the life-affirming intellectual and emotional connections forged among community members that truly give substance and enduring meaning to learning within any integrated subject matter curriculum.
This has been an incredibly insightful deep dive into the world of subject matter integration. We've explored its long recognized importance, the valuable insights gained from initial research on reading and writing, and the promising transformations seen when schools embrace collaborative, school-wide approaches. It's clear that understanding these principles is invaluable for anyone interested in effective learning, whether you're looking to connect ideas in your professional life, grasp a new field of knowledge, or simply satisfy your curiosity about how different pieces of information fit together.
Absolutely. It's about moving beyond seeing knowledge as a collection of isolated facts and recognizing the rich, interconnected tapestry of understanding that emerges when we make connections across different disciplines.
And on that note, here's a final thought for you to consider. Reflecting on the principles we've discussed today, what do you see as some of the primary obstacles or challenges that might hinder the implementation of more integrated approaches in various learning environments? And what innovative solutions might we explore to overcome these challenges and further cultivate this interconnected way of learning? We encourage you to delve deeper into the research we've touched upon and to reflect on your own learning experiences in light of these powerful ideas. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.